The first ring it was 3:17 a.m. when Sundar Pichai woke up to the sharp, cold chime of his doorbell. At first, he thought it was part of a dream, one of those strange, scattered visions you have just before waking up. But then it rang again. The sound echoed through the quiet house, cutting through the deep silence of the night like a blade. Sundar sat up slowly, confused and slightly irritated. It wasn't normal for anyone to visit at that hour. His home, nestled in a quiet California neighborhood, was usually as still as the moonlight outside. He reached for his phone, the bright screen stinging his eyes. The time glared back at him. 3:17 a.m. He frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone, and no one in their right mind would choose this moment to drop by. For a few seconds, he considered ignoring it. But curiosity pushed him out of bed. He grabbed his robe, slid his feet into slippers, and walked toward the front door. His footsteps seemed louder than usual against the wooden floor, almost as if the house itself was holding its breath. When he reached the door, he hesitated. His security system had a camera at the entrance. Instinctively, he checked it on his phone before opening the door. The feed showed nothing. The porch was empty, bathed in the pale glow of the streetlight. The wind moved gently through the trees, but there wasn't a person in sight. No cars, no bikes, no shadows. Sundar's brow furrowed. He opened the door anyway, peeking outside. The night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of wet grass. Still, no one was there. He waited for a minute, scanning the sidewalk and street for movement. Nothing. He stepped back inside, locked the door, and convinced himself it must have been a glitch. Maybe the wind had rattled something, or the system had a false trigger. But as he climbed the stairs back to his room, a strange unease settled in his chest. The next morning, he shrugged it off. The day was packed with meetings, presentations, and endless streams of decisions. As the CEO of one of the largest tech companies in the world, he was no stranger to high pressure. But every now and then his mind wandered back to that sound, the precise, sharp chime that had woken him. It wasn't the doorbell itself that bothered him. It was the exactness of it. 3:17 a.m. Not a minute earlier, not a minute later. It was too precise to be random. The second night, it happened again. This time, Sundar was already half awake, tossing and turning in bed. The chime came exactly at 3:17 a.m., cutting through the darkness with the same unnerving sharpness. He sat up instantly, heart thudding. Without wasting a second, he grabbed his phone and checked the camera feed. Nothing. The porch was empty again. He rushed downstairs, hoping to catch someone if they were moving away. He swung open the door and looked both ways. Still, no one. Not a soul in sight. He stood there for a while, feeling the chill of the early morning air seep into his skin. There was something deeply unsettling about the silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was the kind of silence that felt heavy, like it was holding a secret. By the third night, Sundar was ready. He set an alarm for 3:15 a.m. and sat downstairs in the living room, waiting in the dark. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house were the only sounds. His eyes stayed fixed on the door, and his phone was open to the live feed of the porch camera. When the clock struck 3:17, the doorbell rang loud and clear. Sundar's breath caught. He looked at the feed. Empty. He looked at the door. Still closed. Without hesitating, he yanked it open. Nothing. The same cold air, the same empty porch, the same motionless trees. But this time, there was something new on the doormat. Barely visible in the dim light lay a small folded piece of paper. Sundar bent down and picked it up. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it. Inside, there were only 3 words, written in a neat, careful handwriting. Help me. Please. He froze, reading the words again and again. They were small, almost delicate, yet they carried a weight that pressed into his chest. There was no name, no explanation, nothing else. Sundar looked up and scanned the street one more time. Still empty. He locked the door and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the note. Part of him wanted to call the police right away. But another part, a quieter, deeper part, told him this was something else, something personal. Something he wasn't supposed to just hand over to strangers. The rest of the day, the note burned in his mind. He couldn't focus on meetings. He barely tasted his lunch. And when the sun set, he found himself glancing at the clock again and again, wondering if the doorbell would ring at 3:17 once more. And then it did. This time, when he opened the door, there was no note. But at the edge of his driveway, barely visible in the faint light, he saw the outline of a figure small, thin, and unmoving. Sundar's breath caught. He took a step forward, and the figure suddenly turned and ran into the darkness, disappearing before he could follow. He stood there in the cold, his heart racing. The image of that fragile silhouette burned into his mind. He didn't know who they were or why they had chosen him. But deep down, he felt something, an unshakable certainty, that this was only the beginning. The next night, Sundar decided he would be ready. Not just ready to answer the door, but ready to follow, ready to uncover the truth. Because whoever was ringing his bell at 3:17 a.m. wasn't just playing a game. They were asking for something. Something only he could give Dot. And when the doorbell rang again, he saw what they left behind this time, and it made his blood run cold. Asterisk, the second message they sung was the same sharp, cold, and perfectly timed. 3:17 a.m. on the dot. Sundar had been sitting in the dark for almost an hour. The only light coming from the dim glow of his phone screen as the live feed from the porch camera flickered in silence. He had already made up his mind. Tonight he wouldn't just open the door and look around. He would step outside and follow if necessary. Something in him had shifted from curiosity to a quiet determination. Whoever was behind this wasn't just leaving random notes. They were sending a message, and now it felt urgent. He rose from the couch the moment the bell rang, his pulse quickening. His hand hovered over the door handle for a moment, listening, not just to the chime, but to the stillness that followed. There was no shuffle of feet, no whisper of movement, just that strange, loaded silence. He opened the door quickly, hoping to catch a glimpse of the shadowy figure he had seen the night before Dot at first. It seemed like the porch was empty again. Then his eyes caught it. Lying at the exact center of the doormat, perfectly aligned, was another folded piece of paper. This one was slightly larger than the first, and it looked damp, as though it had been held in someone's sweating palm before being placed there. He bent down slowly, picking it up with the kind of care you might give to something fragile. As he unfolded it, his stomach tightened. In the same neat handwriting as before, the words read, "You promised her?" He froze. Promised who? Sundar's mind immediately began racing. He didn't recognize the handwriting, but the statement felt personal, like it was pointing directly at him. He read it again, the words suddenly feeling heavier, and they should. You promised her. The air felt colder. His gaze flicked to the street, scanning every inch of the shadows. No movement. No sign of anyone. He stepped down from the porch, moving toward the spot where he had seen the figure last night. The street was empty, but something tugged at his attention. A faint sound, so soft it almost blended with the wind. It was coming from the far end of the block, near the tall hedges that lined an old, unused pathway. He moved toward it slowly, his breath visible in the cool night air. The sound grew clearer. It wasn't quite crying, but it wasn't just the wind either. It was a low, uneven hum, like someone talking to themselves in a whisper. Sundar reached the edge of the hedge and stopped, his heart pounding ben, as if sensing him. The whispering stopped. He stepped forward, peering around the hedge. Nothing. Just darkness. But then, from the corner of his eye, he caught movement, a small figure darting down the pathway, fast and deliberate. Instinct took over. Sundar followed. His slippers slapped against the pavement, the cold air biting at his face. The pathway twisted and turned, lit only by the occasional flicker of an old street lamp. He caught glimpses of the figure ahead, small, hunched, wrapped in something oversized like a coat or blanket. But every time he thought he was getting closer, they slipped just out of reach. Finally, the figure stopped abruptly near a rusted gate that led to an abandoned property. Sundar slowed his pace, not wanting to scare them off. Wait, he called out, his voice calm but urgent. I'm not here to hurt you. The figure stood still for a moment, then slowly turned their head toward him. In the dim light, he could just make out a face, pale, gaunt, and young, far younger than he had expected. The eyes that met his were wide and watchful, but not with fear. They held something else, a strange mix of recognition and warning. "You promised her," the voice said, barely more than a whisper. Sundar's chest tightened. "Who?" he asked softly. "Who did I promise?" But before the figure could answer, there was a sudden noise behind them, the crunch of heavy footsteps on gravel. The figure's eyes widened in alarm, and without another word, they turned and slipped through the rusted gate, disappearing into the shadows of the abandoned property. Sundar spun toward the source of the footsteps, but saw nothing, just the dark outline of trees swaying in the wind. The sound had stopped as quickly as it had begun. When he turned back to the gate, it was shut tight again, as if it hadn't been opened in years. Back at his house, Sundar sat at the kitchen table, both notes spread out in front of him. "Help me, please. And you promised her." The second message gnawed at him in a way the first hadn't. He could almost feel it pulling at memories he couldn't quite reach. Like something buried deep that refused to surface. He knew he should tell someone. The police, a friend, anyone. But something told him this wasn't a case for official channels. This was a thread, and if he pulled it, it might unravel something far bigger than he could imagine. He made a decision. Tomorrow, he would go back to that abandoned property in daylight. Maybe then he could find the figure again, or at least some trace of who they were. But as he got up to put the notes away, he noticed something that made his heart jolt. The handwriting on the second note. It was identical to a note he had kept for years, locked away in a box in his study. A note from someone he hadn't spoken to in almost 3 decades. And she was supposed to be dead. Asterisk the handwriting from the gravet. The rest of the night, Sundar barely slept. The quiet hum of the house felt different now, heavier, almost pressing against him. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the notes replaying in his mind over and over like an unsolved puzzle. "Help me, please. You promised her." And now, the most unsettling truth of all, that second note's handwriting. It wasn't just familiar. It was identical. Same neat curves, same deliberate spacing, the slight tilt to the right. He knew because he had studied it countless times before, tracing every letter with his eyes until it became a part of him. That handwriting belonged to Anjali. He had met Anjali when he was 16, back in India. She was his neighbor's niece, sent to live with them for a while after her parents died. She was shy, quiet, but her eyes sparkled when she laughed, and she laughed often around him. They became inseparable. Every day after school, they'd sit on the roof of her uncle's house, sharing roasted peanuts and talking about everything from school gossip to impossible dreams. And then one day, without warning, she was gone. Adults told him she had moved away to live with distant relatives. Months later, the news came that she had died. A car accident, they said. Sundar had cried quietly in his room for nights after, holding the last thing she had ever given him. A small folded note in her handwriting that said, "You'll keep your promise, right?" He had never forgotten those words. He never really understood what she had meant. They were only teenagers, and promises at that age often meant nothing. But to her, it had seemed to mean everything. And now, decades later, he was staring at new words in the same unmistakable handwriting. At dawn, Sundar got out of bed and went to his study. He pulled out the small wooden box from the back of the bottom shelf. Inside, carefully preserved, was the note from all those years ago. He placed it next to the new one on his desk. Side by side, the handwriting was a perfect match. No hesitation, no difference in style despite the gap of decades. It was as though the same hand had written both, and yet that hand was supposed to have been buried years ago. He felt the weight of the mystery settled deeper in his chest. If Anjali was gone, someone was deliberately copying her handwriting to get to him. And if she wasn't gone, then where had she been all this time? Later that morning, Sundar drove to the abandoned property he had chased the figure toward the night before. In daylight, it looked even more neglected than he remembered. A crumbling stone wall lined with rusted gates, weeds pushing up through cracked pavement, windows shattered and covered with boards. He parked nearby and walked the perimeter. Scanning for a way in, he found a gap in the fence along the side, just wide enough to squeeze through. Inside, the yard was overgrown, the grass waist-high in places. The house itself stood in the center, its paint peeling, roofs sagging. Yet there was something strange. On the porch, the dust and dirt were disturbed. As if someone had been walking there recently, he climbed the creaky steps and noticed faint footprints, small enough to belong to a child or very slight adult. They led to the front door, and it stopped. The door itself was secured with an old chain and padlock, both rusty but intact. He decided to circle the house. Around the back, he found a broken window partially covered by a piece of cardboard. It had been moved aside just enough for someone to slip in or out. Sundar crouched and peered inside. The interior was dim, the air heavy with the smell of mold and dust. He could make out old furniture draped with sheets, stacks of boxes, and in the far corner, a small blanket spread neatly on the floor. On top of it was a worn backpack. He called out softly, "I'm not here to hurt you." His voice sounded too loud in the stillness. No answer. He climbed through the window carefully, his feet crunching on debris. The room felt cold, colder than it should in the morning sun. He walked toward the blanket and saw that the backpack was half open, revealing a few items: a small flashlight, a notebook, and what looked like a folded piece of paper. He picked up the paper. Written in the same familiar handwriting were the words, "You're late," before he could process it. A sharp sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the house. A single knock, deliberate and slow. He froze. The knock came again, this time from the hallway to his right. He stepped toward it cautiously, his heart pounding in his ears. The hallway was narrow, lined with closed doors. "Who's there?" He called. Silence. Then, from behind the first door, a soft voice, the same voice he'd heard last night, by the hedge, whispered, "You need to remember, before they find you." He reached for the doorknob. It turned easily, the hinges groaning as the door swung open. Inside, the room was empty except for a small wooden chair in the center. On the seat was another folded note. This time it said, "She's not dead." Sundar's breath caught. He stepped into the room, his mind spinning, but before he could read the note again, the door slammed shut behind him with a force that rattled the walls. The last thing he heard before the lights flickered out was the sound of footsteps running away, small, quick, and fading into the distance. Asterisk, the name no one says, slam of the door echoed in the pitch-black room, the vibration running through Sundar's chest. For a moment, he just stood there, frozen, gripping the note so tightly the edges dug into his palm. The air was thick and musty, each breath tasting faintly of dust and something metallic. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, the kind of deep thud that makes the silence even louder. Slowly, he moved toward the door and tried the handle. Locked. He pressed his shoulder against it, pushing hard, but it didn't budge. Whoever had locked him in hadn't just used the old latch. They had wedged something heavy against the outside. Sundar exhaled slowly, forcing himself to think. Panic wouldn't help him here. He turned back toward the small chair in the center of the room. The note he had found still sat on it. The 3 words, "She's not dead," glowing faintly in the thin sliver of light from a high broken window. His fingers traced the letters as though feeling them might make them tell him more. And J-L-I. The name kept circling his mind like a ghost, refusing to leave. How could she not be dead? Had the story of her accident been a lie? And if it was, why hide her? Who had the power or the reason to erase her from his life so completely? Sundar scanned the room, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. The walls were bare except for a narrow crack in the plaster on one side, running from ceiling to floor like a fault line. In the corner, half hidden in shadows, was a wooden trunk. He walked toward it, each floorboard creaking under his weight. The trunk was old, the brass fittings tarnished, but the lid lifted easily with a groan. Inside were piles of old clothes, faded and stiff with age, and beneath them a bundle of yellowed newspapers tied together with fraying string. The top one had a headline from 20 years ago. Local woman dies in car crash. Body never found. The photo was grainy, but Sundar recognized it instantly. It was Anjali. His hands trembled as he turned the pages. The articles were short, almost dismissive. Number mention of an investigation. No details beyond the vague statement that she had likely been swept away from the accident site. Buried in the back of one paper, there was a small classified ad, circled in pencil. Lost. Gold locket. Heart-shaped. Engraved with "Always keep your promise." Sundar felt his throat tighten. He remembered that locket. He had given it to her on her 17th birthday. A cheap market find, but one she had treasured. If she was alive and had placed this ad, she must have been desperate to reach him. A sudden scraping sound yanked him back to the present. It came from directly above him, slow, deliberate, like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. Dust rained down from the ceiling in soft clouds. Then silence. He crossed the room and stood under the crack in the plaster. His instincts told him someone was up there, maybe even watching. The door lock clicked suddenly. Sundar turned fast, but when he opened it, the hallway beyond was empty. The only sign anyone had been there was a faint smell, a mix of damp earth and something faintly sweet, like old perfume. He stepped out cautiously, his shoes crunching on broken glass. The hallway seemed darker than before, as though the light outside had dimmed. He made his way toward the back of the house, retracing his steps to the window he had used to get in. But before he could reach it, a voice drifted from the end of the hallway. Soft, urgent, and unmistakable. "You're in danger, Sundar." He froze. The figure stepped out of the shadows, small and thin, the oversized coat swallowing their frame. It was the same person from the hedges, from the driveway, the one who kept leaving the notes. Now, in the dim light, he could see a little more messy black hair, sharp eyes that seemed far older than their age. They looked like they couldn't be more than 12 or 13. "Who are you?" he asked. "Someone who owes her." The child said simply, "And now you do too." "Her? You mean Anjali?" The child's expression didn't change, but their eyes flicked toward the front of the house, as if checking for danger. "You're asking the wrong questions. You should be asking who took her." "Took her?" Sundar repeated, the words tasting foreign in his mouth, before the child could answer. The sound of tires crunching on gravel filled the air outside. Headlights flashed briefly through the broken boards of the windows. The child's eyes widened. In alarm. "They're here." "Who?" But the child didn't answer. Instead, they pressed something into Sundar's hand, cold metal, small enough to fit in his palm. "She said you'd know what to do with this." And then they ran, disappearing through a side door so fast he barely registered the movement. Sundar looked down at what they had given him. It was the gold locket, her locket, the one engraved with "Always keep your promise." His heart slammed in his chest. Before he could even breathe, the sound of heavy footsteps and low voices drifted through the front door of the house. And then, from somewhere deep in the house, came a voice he hadn't heard in 30 years. Low, steady, and filled with the kind of calm that freezes your blood. "Sundar, you're not supposed to be here." Asterisk, the man in the doorway. Sound of that voice was like a crack in pulling Sundar back 3 decades in an instant. Every muscle in his body tightened. He didn't need to see the face to know who it belonged to. The calmness wasn't born from kindness, but from control, the same kind of control that could silence a room without raising a hand. He turned slowly toward the source. Standing in the front doorway, framed by the pale wash of early morning light, was Ragam Men. Sundar's old neighbor, Anjali's uncle. Rag hadn't aged the way most men did. While his hair had thinned and turned to cold silver, his posture was still ramrod straight, his presence still carrying that same sharp edge Sundar remembered from boyhood. Back then, Raghav was the man who could cut short your laughter with a single look. The man who always knew when you were somewhere you shouldn't be. The man who kept Anjali on a leash so short it felt like she was always out of breath. I could ask you the same thing, Sundar said finally, trying to keep his voice steady. But inside, the years of unspoken resentment were churning like a storm. You're not supposed to be here either. This place looks abandoned. Raghav stepped inside, each footstep deliberate, echoing against the warped floorboards. It's not abandoned, it's private, and you're trespassing. His eyes dropped briefly to the locket in Sundar's hand. The smallest flicker passed across his face. Recognition, maybe even irritation, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. Where is she? Sundar asked, his voice sharper now. Raghav tilted his head, almost amused. Who? Don't play games. Anjali. You told everyone she was dead. You told me she was dead. But someone's been leaving notes. And now this. Sundar held up the locket. She's alive, isn't she? Raghav didn't answer right away. He took another slow step forward until they were only a few feet apart. You always were stubborn, Sundar. Couldn't leave well enough alone. You don't know what you're walking into. Then tell me, Sundar shot back. There was a long pause. Raghav's eyes scanned the room, as if checking for listening ears. There are things you don't understand. Things she never told you. If she wanted you to find her, she would have done it herself. You need to let this go before you get hurt. The words were calm, but they carried a threat just beneath the surface, like a blade wrapped in silk. Sundar felt the weight of them. But he didn't flinch. If she's alive, she's in trouble. Someone's been at my house every night at 3:17, leaving these. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded notes. So either you tell me what's going on, or I follow the trail myself. Raghav's gaze lingered on the notes, and for the first time, a shadow crossed his expression, something unreadable, but not entirely free of fear. You should stop answering the door, he said quietly before Sundar could respond. Movement caught his eye. At the far end of the hallway, the small figure from the night before appeared again. The child stood completely still, watching them. Raghav noticed too, and his voice hardened instantly. Go home, he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. But the child didn't move. Instead, they spoke, their voice carrying an urgency that made Sundar's skin prickle. Don't trust him. He's the one who... Raghav moved suddenly, his hand darting toward the inside of his coat. Instinctively, Sundar stepped between them, his heart hammering. Stop! The child turned and bolted through the side door, vanishing into the overgrown yard. Raghav didn't follow. Instead, he straightened his coat and looked at Sundar with an expression that was almost pity. You have no idea what you've just done, he said. Then explain it to me. Raghav's eyes narrowed. Come to the old train yard at midnight. Alone. You want your answers. You'll get them there. But you'll wish you hadn't. And with that, he walked out, his footsteps fading into the distance until the house felt empty again. Sundar stood there, the locket warm in his hand, the notes crumpled in his pocket, his thoughts tangled in a mess of fear and determination. The train yard was miles away, a place he hadn't set foot in since he was a teenager, a place where secrets were buried, sometimes literally. He knew two things for certain. He would go, and he would not be going alone. But as he turned to leave, his phone buzzed. There was a new message from an unknown number. It said, if you go to the train yard tonight, you'll never see her again. Asterisk, the last promise hath. Warning message glared at Sundar from his phone. Screamed like a red light in the dark. If you go to the train yard tonight, you'll never see her again. He read it twice, 3 times, but his heart had already made the decision before his mind could catch up. Fear was there, yes, but it sat behind something heavier. The weight of 30 years of unanswered questions. Of a promise he didn't even fully understand, but had never stopped feeling responsible for. He slipped the locket around his neck, tucking it beneath his shirt. It felt strange there, like it was meant to be close to his heartbeat. He knew this wasn't just a meeting, it was a confrontation, and maybe even the final page of a story that had been stuck open since he was 16. The hours crawled by. At 11:30 p.m., he left the house, driving without music, the silence in. The car as thick as fog. The old train yard was on the edge of the city, hidden behind warehouses and stretches of rusting fence. By the time he arrived, the air was colder, the moon casting pale light across the empty tracks. He parked a short distance away and walked in, his footsteps crunching on gravel. The place smelled of old oil and iron, the kind of scent that never fades no matter how many years pass. Rugov was already there, standing beneath the skeletal frame of an old freight crane. He looked smaller in the vast emptiness, but his posture was still unyielding. "You came," Rugov said, his voice carrying easily through the still air. "You said you had answers," Sundar replied, keeping his tone even. Rugov studied them. For a long moment before speaking, Anjali didn't die, but she couldn't stay. There were people looking for her, dangerous people, the kind who don't stop. I kept her hidden to protect her. Hidden? Sundar's voice sharpened. You made her disappear. You made me believe she was gone. Because if you'd known she was alive, you would have tried to find her, and that would have gotten her killed. Urgov's words were calm, but there was a tightness to them now, a crack in his composure. Then why now? Why the notes? Why the locket? Rugov's gaze shifted. Because the people who were after her, they found her again? Before Sundar could respond, movement stirred in the shadows beyond the tracks. The small figure from before stepped into the dim light, the child with the sharp eyes. They walked up slowly, glancing between the two men. He's lying. The child said, their voice steady despite their size. He's not protecting her. He's keeping her here. Sundar's heart skipped. Here? In the city? The child nodded. In the abandoned house. In the basement. Rogov's face hardened. Enough? He snapped. But the child didn't flinch. You don't even know who I am, do you? The child asked, looking straight at Sundar. I'm her son. The words hit him like a physical blow. The child's eyes, sharp, observant, were unmistakably hers. The same dark brown flecked with gold, the same way they narrowed slightly when focused. Anjali? She's alive? Sundar said, his voice barely a whisper. The child nodded. Once. She sent me to you. She said you were the only one she could trust. Rage and disbelief collided in Sundar's chest. He turned to Rugov. You've kept her prisoner all these years? Rugov didn't answer directly. She's safe where she is. Safe? Sundar's voice cracked now. Safe doesn't mean locked away from the world. Safe doesn't mean separated from her child's father.